reading for tonight comes from Proverbs chapter 16, verses 18 and 19. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. Title tonight is Poison Pride. And pride can be a poison. I mean, do you know anybody that is really proud of themselves? You can usually tell because their favorite words are me and I. They like to talk about themselves. They like to build themselves up. But pride is a poison that causes destruction if it's not reined in. I mean, it's okay to be proud to be a Christian, but our pride needs to be in God and what He's done for us. You know, we see some very humble people at the birth of Jesus when you think about it. Mary and Joseph were humble people. That's why God chose them. And they were humble enough to be submissive to God, even when the plan didn't make any sense. And of course, the shepherds. The shepherds were always humble because they had no social standing. I mean, they stunk. They smelled like sheep. People didn't care for them. And then, of course, later, even the Magi, the rich men that brought all the gifts, they humbled themselves before this infant. But we also see one very prideful player at the time, King Herod. He was full of pride. How did his pride affect him? Well, he allowed it to rule the way that he thought, and it created some real issues for him. First, we want to look at the fact that the Magi come to Jerusalem. They come seeking the king born to the Jews. Now, when they ask about this, about where Jesus is, notice the reaction of Herod in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 3. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. I suppose I can understand his point. Herod was supposed to be the king of the Jews. Rome had put him in charge. But now here come these men asking, where is the king of the Jews? He don't know how to answer. In Herod's defense, he really didn't know the prophecies of Jesus. He didn't understand the scriptures. He had to ask the Jews where he was to be born. See, any good Jewish citizen, any good Jewish boy and girl, they were raised understanding that the Messiah was going to come out of Bethlehem. That's what the prophecy said. But he didn't know. He didn't know. But the fact that they came and asked this question disturbed him very much. So Herod devises a plan. He don't like the idea that he's going to be replaced. He don't like the idea that the throne is going to be taken away from him. But of course, again, remember, he's thinking a physical kingdom. He's thinking somebody that's going to usurp his authority. So he secretly calls the Magi and asks exactly where the star they were following appeared. When did it appear? Where did it appear? Because he has a plan. In Matthew chapter 2 and verse 8, he says, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. Sounds logical enough. I mean, listening to the Magi, how they described it, the things that were going on, that they knew the prophecies. Makes sense that maybe the king would want to go worship him. But why wouldn't Herod put forth the effort himself to go and worship him if that's really what he wanted to do? Why would he say, well, you go find him and tell me exactly where he's at? Because that's not what he wanted to do. He didn't want to put forth the effort. Probably what he was saying to the Magi was, you come and tell me where he's at so I can go kill him. Because he's going to be a thorn in my side. Because I am the King of the Jews. But Herod's plan is thwarted. Herod's plan goes off the rails. Because the Magi, the Bible tells us, come to the house where Jesus was and worshiped him. But they were warned not to go back the same way. I always imagine what it must have been like. These men, probably decked out in expensive robes and royal robes even, presenting these expensive gifts to this child. Think about the sign of humility that is. Think about how Joseph and Mary must have felt. I mean, they understood at that time who Jesus was. And it was explained to them from the very beginning who Jesus was. And it seemed like as he grew and got older, they may have forgotten. They may have let it slip their mind. But at this time, they knew exactly who Jesus was. But here they see these men worshiping their son. It had to be an eye-opener. It had to be something exciting. But as we said, Herod's plan is thwarted because they're warned. Matthew 2 and verse 12 says, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by a different route. Now you can imagine Herod sitting in his castle waiting for these men to come back. And they don't ever come back. They don't ever return. He's thinking, I'm the king. I told them this is what they had to do. They should have done it, but they never do. Why? They were warned. And they begin to understand this is what God desires. They want us to go, he wants us to go a different way and not come back and tell Herod where the child is. And so they was obedient to God. And we see that throughout the scriptures, different people being told by people to do things, but God saying, no. That's not the way it's going to work. And we have to understand, God's word always rules over man's word. What God says is always right. Well, at this point, Herod becomes furious. He's not very happy that these men didn't listen to him. They didn't obey him. And of course, Herod's pride was bruised. When you have someone like Herod, someone who feels he's the most important person in the world, and you tell somebody to do something and they don't do it, that's going to bruise your pride, isn't it? It's going to make you feel bad. You're like, how in the world could they do that? How could they deny me? His plan had been ruined, so he still could have gone to Bethlehem on his own. But pride wouldn't allow that. He wouldn't allow himself to stoop down to that level and go search for the child. Even though the wise men did not come back and tell him where he was. I mean, Bethlehem, it's not like it was a sprawling city. It would have been relatively easy to find him because I'm sure people knew where he was. I'm sure. So what does he do now? What does he do now? Well, Matthew chapter 2 and verse 16 says, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time that he had learned from the Magi. when our pride gets hurt, it can often cause us to lash out and be irrational. And certainly, when we look at the plan that Herod has put in place, it's certainly irrational, isn't it? It's certainly not logical. But he started counting back to the time that the Magi said they saw the star. And figured, okay, it's been about 2 years since this king was to appear. And so his plan, it's a throwback to Egypt, isn't it? Let's kill all the young males in Bethlehem, 2 years old and under. Just like Pharaoh said in Egypt for the Israelites. That didn't work either. And so this isn't going to work. We think about how this plan is to be instituted. And of course, we think of it in modern terms, and we think how difficult it could be. In the ancient Near East, it was almost like citizens had virtually no rights. You know, the king could order whatever he wanted, and you had to be obedient to it, or you had to suffer the consequences. That's what made following God difficult at that time, because so many of the people were doing it at risk of their lives. Because so many of the kings, so many of the leaders had nothing to do with God. And those that followed God, those that wanted to be obedient to God, they often had to defy the man-made rules and regulations. And so can you imagine being a parent of a young boy in Bethlehem and somebody knocks on your door and says, "Give me your son. Give me your son." It wasn't your option to ask questions. It wasn't your option to say, "No, I don't think I will." They would just take it. They would just take it. Pride can be blinding. Because here, Herod's second plan is foiled. So his next plan, to kill all Hebrew boys 2 years old and younger, isn't going to work. But think about how evil and how prideful a man must be to even think of such a plan. He has no heart, no compassion for people, no value on human life except his own. But yet here's the plan. Never thinking about all the families that he would affect. The Jewish historian Josephus even tells us that Herod killed 3 of his own sons. Caesar Augustus said about Herod, "It's better to be one of Herod's hogs than his sons." Think about that. That was the Roman emperor that puts him in charge. Says it's better to be one of his hogs than one of his sons. But he treats him better. Got more of a chance to live. God made sure that the plan would not touch Jesus. We don't know how many children were slaughtered during this time. Even if any of them were, the Bible doesn't tell us. But God made sure that it doesn't touch Jesus. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 13 said, "And when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream," thinking about the Magi. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child and kill him." This is almost kind of a twist on the way God does things too, because a lot of times God would call his people and says, "Go here." And that's all there was. But here he told Joseph, "Go to Egypt, because Herod is seeking to kill my son." My son. He said, and stay there until I tell you that it's safe to come back. So can you imagine, here you are in the middle of the night, packing up, getting ready to go away, not just from your home, but from your country, into a country that one time held your people as slaves. So escape there. Escape there. And as we said earlier, pride is blinding. You don't always see things clearly when you're full of pride. You don't always recognize things. Remember how Herod reacted to the Magi in Matthew 2:8 when he said, go and make a careful search for the child. Herod was disturbed about what he heard, but he couldn't bring himself to recognize Jesus for who he truly was, the king. He couldn't recognize the fact that someday there's going to be a successor to the throne. And the way he was killing off his own sons, it wasn't going to be from his family. But his pride was so big and so blinding that he couldn't recognize that this was going to be the king, because he didn't take time to get to know or understand his subjects, the Jews, or understand their religion, understand their prophecies. Because he was too proud, he didn't understand who Jesus was. He didn't understand this was going to come to pass. He didn't understand the power that God possessed. Because he thought nobody was more powerful than him. He wasn't even remembering that he was put in charge. That somebody put him in the position that he was in. Herod's pride was the end of him. He died a horrible, painful death. He was going through so much suffering and pain at the end that he continually tried to stab himself to end the pain. But it kind of ran in the family. His grandson was also prideful. Remember back in Acts chapter 12, he was eaten by worms because of his pride. Because he didn't give God glory. So it was a Herod thing, apparently. To be proud. To lift yourself up. To be self-promoting. And both of them died horrible, horrible deaths. Friends, pride comes at a high price. It may not seem like it does, but a pedestal is a great place to fall from. They're not always stable. You can't always keep your balance. Think about our text for today, Proverbs 16:18, where it says, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Did you ever play King of the Mountain when you was a kid? Think about that game. If you are the king, what's everybody else trying to do? They're trying to knock you down off the pedestal, off the hill, because they want to be king. And so what do? You go after them. And that's the way it is when you're in high places. People come after you. People want to knock you down. And when we get prideful, we put ourselves up on a pedestal, and those are never steady. Those are never strong enough to hold us for very long. We try to build ourselves up. We're always going to fall. Always. You know, sometimes we see it in athletes and different other people. There are certain things that they should do. maybe certain safety equipment they should wear, but pride won't allow them to do it. And then they suffer a terrible injury. Well, if only you would have had the right equipment on and not been too proud. I always remember when seatbelts became the big thing back in the early 70s when they started really promoting to wear your seatbelt. And I remember the commercials that they would show, and one I always remember is the lady says, well, I don't wear mine because it wrinkles my dress. And then, of course, they flash to show her in a complete body cast, from head to toe. And it was just trying to get people to understand how important seatbelts are. Studies shown they save lives. I'm not going to argue one way or the other. But sometimes pride allows us to make bad decisions and will come at a high price. But Paul, he gives us some great advice in Romans chapter 12, in verse 3. Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. Think about what that means. We are God's children. We've been bought with a price. That means we have value. And when we start thinking about that, and thinking about that Jesus gives me worth, it can be a slippery slope to becoming prideful. But then again, if we remember, Jesus gave his life willingly for me, it brings us back down a little bit. It helps us remember that Jesus did something for me that I couldn't do for myself. And yeah, I still struggle with sin. I still struggle with dealing with the evil around me, and I still struggle with different things like that. But God has given me worth, and that's the only place my worth comes from. It's from God. And that helps us not to think of ourselves more highly than we should. I mean, we're all valued the same in the eyes of God. We're all washed in the blood, and it cost the life of Jesus. Several scriptures in the Bible tell us the importance of being humble. Your homework is to look them up. Can't put them all up here today. But just look them up and look and see how often we're told to act with humility or to be humble or to be a servant. All the different things that remind us not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to. G.K. Chesterton said, how much larger your life would be if yourself could become smaller. Think about what he's saying there. Your life has more value to other people the more humble you become. And not being self-promoting. When you're thinking of others. When you're thinking of their worth and their employees. Finally, the best way to do that is focus on Jesus. Focus on him and realize who Jesus is, what he did. If we spend more time looking at Jesus and less time looking at ourselves, we will truly learn to be like him. So many times in our pride, we're worried about us. We're worried about looking in the mirror and saying, oh, this person did that to me. Oh, I've been hurt there. Friends, none of us has suffered like Jesus did. And none of us have lived a perfect life like Jesus did. If someone never deserved to suffer, it was Jesus. But he continued to be humble in his life. He continued on his mission, no matter how much persecution he faced. He continued to carry out the plan that God put him here to do. And verse we look at every week in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 29, notice how Jesus describes himself. I am gentle and humble in heart. the way we need to be described. Gentle and humble in heart. Because after all, that's our goal, to reflect Jesus. Not allow pride to get the best of us. Not allow ourselves to have a big self-worth that causes us to place ourselves above other people. You know, we all struggle with pride in some form, some people more than others. You know, it can be arrogance. And maybe it's self-depreciation. You know, just because somebody thinks they have no worth, that's still a form of pride. You're still drawing attention to yourself. Even though you keep telling people, I can't do that. Because sometimes it's all about wanting people to say, oh, yes, you can. Searching for those compliments, searching for that encouragement. But we need to know our worth. We are worth the blood of Jesus. But that should not make us proud. Too proud to share that with other people. We're proud that we are part of the family of God. We're proud in God, but not proud in our life. Because we've been washed in the blood, we've been saved by the life of Jesus, and that should humble us. That should keep our feet on the ground. And being humble doesn't mean being useless. There is a happy medium. We're not too high and mighty to do any job for God, nor are we too low to be useful. Whatever God calls us to do, the humble person says, I'm here, God. I'll do it. I'll do it. Not, that's a little bit below my pay grade. I've been a Christian too long to get involved with that. Never. Whatever God calls us to do, we do. We're children of the King, and we're workers in His vineyard. We should never let pride get in our way. Just allow ourselves to be humble before God, to be humble before mankind, and be a servant to all, like Jesus told His disciples in John chapter 13. As long as we keep that mindset, we will keep pride in check. And we won't have to worry about building ourselves up too high. Think about your life. Think about the way you think about yourself. Do you have pride? Probably, we all do. But does it get in your way in service? If your pride does get in your way of service, take it to God. Ask Him to help you clear your heart and your mind and learn how to think of yourself in the right way. How you can become the servant you need to be. Maybe you need to respond to God for some other reason. You have the opportunity now to do that as we stand and as we sing.
Number 800. Let's just sing the first.